Good morning. God's kings over his kingdom were supposed to be a pillar of righteousness. They were supposed to be men who would lead the people in faithfulness to be faithful to God. They were supposed to be teachers of the law, judges over the people, so that righteousness was dealt out. They were supposed to be examples to the people of what was to be done before the Lord. David, the second king of the United Nation of Israel, was a sort of example for what God's desired king would look like. He was a man after God's heart. He wasn't perfect, but he was pretty good. And all the kings after him would be put to a sort of scale comparing them to David. Were they like David, their father, before them or not? And there are some standout kings that came after David, men who followed in David's footsteps and did pretty well. You have kings like Hezekiah, who walked in the steps of David, who tore down idols that previous kings had put up. Hezekiah, who in Judah's lowest moment, when faced with certain death by the armies of Assyria outside their walls, he prays to God, giving it into God's hands, and God delivers them. He restored righteousness and faithfulness to the people. And then you had kings like Josiah, who is basically called Judah's greatest king. Josiah, who found the book of the law, read it, mourned that they weren't following it, and did all that he did to help the people follow the law, to teach them the law. Even though he knew the situation was basically hopeless, he still did everything in his power to do the right thing. Tearing down idols, restoring the Passover, fixing the mistakes of his fathers before him. Great kings, remarkable kings, but we're not going to talk about any of those kings today. Not all the kings of Judah were great. Not all the kings walked in the steps of David, but sadly, many of God's kings, kings that should have been faithful, should have been good, fell short of the mark. And usually when you're reading through the books of Kings and Chronicles, where we read about these kings, you get an idea of how this king is going to turn out through the first sentence or first verse about that king. It tells you the name of the king, who was their father, how long they ruled, and really where was their faith. Sometimes with kings like Hezekiah and Josiah, you read that they walked in the footsteps of their father David all their life, and you know, this is going to be a good king then. But then you have kings like Ahaziah in 2 Chronicles chapter 22, and he, along with many of the other kings, kind of reads like this. So in 2 Chronicles chapter 22, it reads this. The inhabitants of Jerusalem made Ahaziah, his youngest son, king in his place, because the troops had come with the Arabs to the camp and had killed all the older sons. So Ahaziah, son of Jehoram, became king of Judah. Ahaziah was 22 years old when he became king, and he reigned 1 year in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Athaliah, granddaughter of Omri. He walked in the ways of the house of Ahab, for his mother gave him evil advice. So he did what was evil in the Lord's sight, like the house of Ahab. For they were his advisors after the death of his father to his destruction. He also followed their advice and went with Joram, son of Israel's king Ahab, to fight against King Hazael of Aram in Ramoth Gilead. We'll stop right there. Many kings walked like Ahaziah after evil, terrible things. Some say they walked after the steps of Jeroboam, Israel, the northern kingdom's first king, who set up idols and set up this false state of worship so that people didn't go worship the one true God. Here, it says that Ahaziah walked in the steps of Ahab, Israel's worst king. The king that brought in all sorts of different idols and set up temples all over the place and sought to kill all of God's prophets. One of the most wicked men to walk this earth, and one of Judah's kings, one of the sons of David, who should have been faithful to God, walked as Ahab did. But there are some kings who don't start out evil like this, but they start off well, they start off strong, walking in the steps of David, doing the right thing, and yet along the way they lose sight of what's important. They lose sight of the goal, and they fall short. They had the potential to be someone like Hezekiah or Josiah and do great things for God's work, God's kingdom, and lead the people as they ought to, and yet they end up like Ahaziah and walking in the steps of Ahab. Instead of fixing the problem the fathers created, they make the problem worse in the end. And I see no better example of a king like this than Joash, who is actually the son of Ahaziah. Joash was a king who had reformation in mind at the beginning. He saw the mistakes and the sins of his father, and he sought to correct some of them and do better. And yet somewhere along his way, along his rule, he turned away from all of that, turned his back on everything he knew was right, and just committed the sins of his father, but even worse. And so the sermon title for this morning is How to Be a Loser. But more of the idea is how to not be a loser. Because Joash was someone who had everything set up for him to do the right thing. He had everything going for him. He had the potential for success, and he fumbled in the last minute and ruined everything that he had built before him. And so we need to look at the mistakes of someone like Joash and learn how to avoid mistakes that he made. Because I think, although we are not kings over a nation, we can easily make the mistakes that Joash did, easily lose sight of our goal and our path as we walk after God and fall short of the mark. And so we're going to look at Joash's story, see what went wrong in his life, and hopefully take away some important lessons from this. But before we get into the story of Joash, we need a little bit of context. We read a bit in chapter 22, reading about his father Ahaziah. Ahaziah was wicked, terrible, brought in idols like Baal into God's temple, into God's worship, set up false idols and taught the people to pray to them instead of the one true God. And there was a major player in this who kind of influenced Ahaziah to take this direction, and that was his mother, Athaliah. She's the sort of evil queen of the story. She's influencing him to do evil, influencing him to go to Ahab and his advisors and his sons for advice. And so Ahaziah does these wicked things, and his rule only lasts 1 year. Because he's so terrible, so wicked, God has him killed quickly. He is assassinated. But the rule doesn't immediately go to Joash. Joash is about 1 year old at the time. But instead, Athaliah, the evil queen of the story, kind of seizes power when she gets the chance. She was the advisor, and now her son's dead, and it's her chance to kind of slip in and take over this power vacuum. So she takes rule. And what does she do? Let's read about this. Looking at the end of 2 Chronicles 22, we read this. When Athaliah, Ahaziah's mother, saw her son was dead, she proceeded to annihilate all the royal heirs of the house of Judah. Jehoshabeth, the king's daughter, rescued Joash, son of Ahaziah, from the king's sons who were being killed, and put him and the one who nursed him in a bedroom. Now Jehoshabeth was the daughter of King Jehoram and the wife of the priest Jehoiada. Since she was Ahaziah's sister, she hid Joash from Athaliah so that she did not kill him. While Athaliah reigned over the land, he was hiding with them in God's temple 6 years. So Athaliah seizes control, and the first thing she does is she seeks to kill everyone who would challenge her power. She's going out and killing all the heirs of Ahaziah so that she can remain in control and do terrible, wicked things. But Jehoshabeth, the sister of Ahaziah, was not evil like he was, but she was faithful to God. And she takes Joash, her nephew, and rescues him from this fate, from this massacre, and hides him in the temple. And her husband is Jehoiada, a faithful priest who Paul read about for us just a few moments ago. So this is a power couple, as we might call them, two incredibly faithful people in a nation that is terribly wicked right now. And they saved Joash at 1 year old to raise him up, teach him to be faithful, and put him on the throne when the time is right so that he could lead the people faithfully. So Joash is set up with two good adoptive parents, his aunt and uncle, who raised him to be faithful, two incredibly influential people in their time. And he's set up to be king after Athaliah is killed. And so Jehoiada is a mentor to Joash to be faithful, teaches him to be right, and we see the product of that in the beginning of his rule. Joash starts off as a reformer, sort of like Hezekiah and Josiah, seeking to do the right thing. And he doesn't have to start from scratch like Hezekiah and Josiah. Josiah, who basically knew nothing about God's law and was learning it as an adult, Joash was raised in this by faithful people. And Jehoiada before him started this reformation. We read about that at the end of 2 Chronicles 23, how Jehoiada, the faithful priest, made a covenant with all the people to do the right thing, to reestablish their relationship with God and turn away from their idols and go and destroy these idols, tear down these false temples, and to be faithful to God once again. And Joash sort of inherits this reformation. So he doesn't have to start from scratch. He has a foundation to work with. And let's see what he does with that foundation. Let's look at Joash's works of reformation. In 2 Chronicles chapter 24, we read about Joash's rule. Joash was 7 years old when he became king, and he reigned 40 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Zibiah, and she was from Beersheba. Throughout the time of the priest Jehoiada, Joash did what was right in the Lord's sight. Jehoiada acquired 2 wives for him, and he was the father of sons and daughters. Afterwards, Joash took it to heart to renovate the Lord's temple. So he gathered the priests and Levites and said, "Go out to the cities of Judah and collect silver from all Israel to repair the temple of your God as needed year by year, and do it quickly." However, the Levites did not hurry, so the king called Jehoiada the high priest and said, "Why haven't you required the Levites to bring from Judah and Jerusalem the tax imposed by the Lord's servant Moses and the assembly of Israel for the tent of the testimony? For the sons of that wicked Athaliah broke into the Lord's temple and even used the sacred things of the Lord's temple for the Baals." So we'll stop right there. We read that early on in Joash's reign, he has it set in his heart to repair God's temple. During the reign of his grandmother, who was evil and wicked, the temple had been destroyed to a degree. It was worn down, tore down. They broke into it, messed up things, and even took a lot of the items used for God's worship and used it for Baal instead. So the temple was in a terrible state, and something needed to be done about it. And so Joash wants to take up this collection to restore the temple to its former glory, to repair the damages, and we see him sort of enforce that among the people. They're unwilling at first, but Joash has this collection taken up. And we read at the end here of this story in verse 13, "The workers did their work, and through them the repairs progressed. They restored God's temple to its specifications and reinforced it. And when they finished, they presented the rest of the silver to the king and Jehoiada, who made articles for the Lord's temple with it, articles for ministry and for making burnt offerings, and ladles and articles of gold and silver. They regularly offered burnt offerings in the Lord's temple throughout Jehoiada's life." So Joash accomplishes this great goal that he sets out to do, to fix the temple so that it's once again up to God's standards, up to God's specifications, and it's put back into use again. But this is the end of Joash's reform. This is all that he really does for God's work. This is a great thing, and yet this marks the end of his work. And the question is, why does he stop here? Why is this the only thing that Joash does? Because we're going to see there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. Well, I think the issue and the red flag in this is, what is it that Joash actually accomplished? Joash set out to just make the temple look good again, to build it up, to repair it, but he didn't actually address any of the sinful issues the people had. He was focused on the exterior, making things look good, and he never addressed the real problem, which is the heart of the people. The heart of the people was not quite set on doing the work of God and turning back to God. We saw partially them turning back with Jehoiada, but many people were still not committed. And we see that with Joash taking up the collection. He was trying to do a good thing, and the people were unwilling to budge on it for the longest time. In their hearts, deep down, they still had idolatry set there. And there needed to be a deeper reformation, a spiritual reformation that addressed the issue, which was sin. Joash never addressed the deeper issue. He was too focused on the outside, on just what everything looked like instead of the actual hearts of the people. And because of this, the hearts of the people are going to pull Joash away because he never addressed the real issue. What makes kings like Hezekiah and Josiah stand out is they didn't just repair the temple, but they repaired the hearts of the people as well. People who were afflicted with idolatry, just as the people of Joash's time. Hezekiah and Josiah made it their priority, not just an effort, their priority, their main goal, to restore the faithfulness of the people, to tear down any stumbling block, any idol that got in their way, so that the people can be focused on being faithful to God. Joash missed this. He did not make this a priority, and because of this, we're going to see his downfall quickly from this. And there is a certain event that marks this downfall of Joash. And you might have gotten hints of it as we've been reading through the text, because it says that throughout Jehoiada's life, Joash was faithful. Throughout Jehoiada's life, they served in the temple and made sacrifices, but Jehoiada does not stay alive for all of Joash's reign. In verse 15, Jehoiada died when he was old and full of days. He was 130 years old at his death. He was buried in the city of David with the kings because he had done what was good in Israel in respect to God and his temple. So Jehoiada, the faithful priest, the one who started this reformation, the one who raised Joash to be faithful, helped save his life and hid him, who did all these good things. He dies, and he is recognized as being one of the most influential people in Judah. He is buried with the good kings. He is recognized for his great actions. But after Jehoiada's death, there's another power vacuum in the advisory of Joash, and it is filled by not faithful people, but wicked ones. Continuing in verse 17, it reads, "However, after Jehoiada died, the rulers of Judah came and paid homage to the king. Then the king listened to them. And they abandoned the temple of the Lord, the God of their ancestors, and served the Asherah poles and the idols. So there was wrath against Judah and Jerusalem for this guilt of theirs." We'll stop reading right there. So men who were leaders in Judah came to pay homage to Joash. And what do? They influenced him for evil. Just like Athaliah did to her son Ahaziah, just like Ahab's advisors did to Ahaziah, terrible influences crept in and pulled Joash away from what was right. I think part of the issue here is that Joash never individually committed himself to this. He was living out Jehoiada's faith before him. And once that influence, once that anchor of his faith was gone, there was nothing holding him to this because he was not personally committed and convicted in this. And so when a new idea comes around and pulls him away, he immediately listens and gives in. And now instead of fixing his father's mistakes, he's bringing them right back into the temple. He's setting up Asherah poles again. He's setting up idols to Baal, terrible things that got his father killed. He is now doing the same thing. Joash quickly turned from being a reformer, someone set to do good, and is now a terrible rebel walking in the steps of Ahab. Sadly, this is not a story that's going to end well. This is not a story with a happy ending, but is a tragedy, the fall of someone great. And yet, despite this, God had not given up on Joash yet. God would make calls for Joash to return because Joash knew what was right. He was raised in this. And so God would send prophets to try and call Joash and the people back to recognize their sins, but they would refuse to listen. Let's continue reading in verse 19. Nevertheless, he sent them prophets to bring them back to the Lord. They admonished them, but the people would not listen. The Spirit of God enveloped Zechariah, son of Jehoiada the priest. He stood above the people and said to them, "This is what God says. Why are you transgressing the Lord's commands so that you do not prosper? Because you have abandoned the Lord, he has abandoned you." But they conspired against him and stoned him at the king's command in the courtyard of the Lord's temple. King Joash didn't remember the kindness that Zechariah's father Jehoiada had extended to him, but killed his son. While he was dying, he said, "May the Lord see and demand an account." So God sends prophets to try and call Joash back to do his right, him and the people, but they refused to listen. No matter what God said, Joash refused to pay attention. And God makes a last effort for Joash by sending Zechariah. He's not just any prophet, but Zechariah is the son of Jehoiada, the man who was so faithful to Joash, who saved his life, who raised him. Zechariah was his cousin. They were probably raised together, probably saw each other as brothers, and it's Zechariah who makes this last call to Joash to return to God. He said, all these terrible things are happening to you because you abandoned God, because you abandoned the temple that you fixed up. But Joash doesn't listen to Zechariah, just like the prophets before, but he takes it a step further here. Zechariah, his own flesh and blood, someone who cared deeply enough to speak to him, Joash commanded that he be dragged into the temple of God, which he paid to refurbish, and have him stoned at the altar of God. I can't think of a bigger slap to the face of God than taking his prophet, dragging it to his house, and killing him right there. Murdering God's prophet in God's temple. It is the loudest thing you could shout to God, saying, "I do not care about what you have to say." It is one of the saddest, most tragic stories you'd read about in the Bible. A story Jesus would reference to the Pharisees, the spiritual leaders of his day, where he says, "Your people have killed God's prophets from Abel to Zechariah." This is the Zechariah Jesus was talking about. Zechariah who was killed, stoned, murdered in God's temple at the command of Joash. Someone who should have known better, who should have been faithful, refused to listen to sound advice. Killed his own family for this. And so in Zechariah's last words, he calls for justice. He calls for judgment. A statement of vengeance at the end of this life, but not personal vengeance, but rather he calls God to see what evil is being done in the country, to see the evil influence of Joash, and to deal with it. Because Joash was not only leading himself to destruction, but he was leading the people to destruction. The king, as we talked about in the beginning, played a major role of influencing the people to do right or wrong. And if the king is good, we often see the people follow in step and are good. But if the king is terrible and evil and wicked like Joash, the people follow after his advice. The people stoned Zechariah after the command of Joash. He is leading them to do this evil, and so he needed to be dealt with in order to protect the people. So Joash is quickly dealt with after the death of Zechariah. Continuing in verse 23, we'll finish the story here. At the turn of the year, an Aramean army attacked Joash. They entered Judah and Jerusalem and destroyed all the leaders of the people among them and sent all the plunder to the king of Damascus. Although the Aramean army came, and with only a few men, the Lord handed over a vast army to them because the people of Judah had abandoned the Lord, the God of their ancestors, so they executed judgment on Joash. And when the Arameans saw that Joash had many wounds, they left him. His servants conspired against him and killed him on his bed because he had shed the blood of the sons of the priest Jehoiada. So he died, and they buried him in the city of David, but they did not bury him in the tombs of the kings. Those who conspired against him were Zabad, son of the Ammonite woman Shemaeth, and Jehozabad, son of the Moabite woman Shimrith. The accounts concerning his sons, the many divine pronouncements against him, and the restoration of God's temple are recorded in the writing of the book of Kings. His son Amaziah became king in his place. So Joash's long rule is brought to an end when a foreign nation comes in and practically kills him right there, leaving him for dead, and two servants finish the job. Two servants of Joash who saw how terrible he was, saw his wicked influence, and decided to take action and snuff out this evil flame. And there's another even bigger slap to the face of the readers here. We read that the two men who killed Joash, who were so faithful to God to do this action, were two foreigners, two Gentiles, an Ammonite and a Moabite. Two nations who were closely related to Judah, but they were not Judeans. And so this is the end of Joash's rule. The fall from power. A lesson for us all. How not to be a loser. Someone who lost sight of his ways, who started off strong, like probably many of us have, in following God, but down the line, he was pulled by terrible influences, led to do evil, and abandoned God, abandoned all the work he did, destroyed not only his work of reformation, but everything that Jehoiada had done, and he forgot all the good that that man did for him. So what lessons can we pull from this? How can we learn from Joash? Well, there's three lessons I want us to take away from this story. Three very important lessons that I think are very applicable to everyone here. Lesson one is you must make your faith your own. You can't just live out the faith of your parents or your spouse or your mentors or your friends, people who brought you to God, brought you to faith. You must make this your own faith. Being faithful to God is a personal commitment, a personal conviction that each person must make. If you're just living out your faith because other people around you are faithful and you're not personally committed to this, you're going to fall like Joash did. He didn't personally commit himself to this. So when his influence of good was gone, when his anchor, the person whose faith he was living after, was gone, he left and abandoned the faith. He was not personally rooted or founded in it. Sadly, I've seen this occur over and over and over again in my own life. I was raised in the church, grew up in the church among many young people. I was very blessed with a church with a lot of people my age. So I grew up getting close with these people, becoming friends with them. We helped influence one another, going to Bible class in the morning every Sunday together. These were people who would come every week and would raise their hands and answer every question correctly. And you'd think that is someone who is, incredibly faithful and intelligent and smart and knows that this is the truth. But sadly, they were never personally committed to this. They never made their faith their own. So once they moved out and went off to live on their own, they quickly fell away. And for a while, I kind of was in that same boat. I'm the son of a preacher raised going to church, and everyone just assumed I was the most faithful person because that's how my family was. And I would go to church and I would answer every question in class, but for a while I didn't make my faith my own. I didn't commit and convict myself to this, and so I quickly was taken by the influences of the world. And until I decided to make this my own and personally acknowledge this and commit myself to this, did my faith really have any motion. And so each and every one of us needs to sit down, think through this, really consider what God is saying here, what he's offering here, and decide if we are going to commit ourselves to this. It's a choice that only we can make for ourselves. No one can make it for us. God won't make it for us. He leaves that option to us. So are you really personally committed to this life, to following God? The second lesson that I want us to take from this is that we have to address then our issue with sin at the heart. If we are going to commit ourselves to this, there needs to be a change, a transformation. And that needs to happen at the heart where sin comes from. We can't just appear righteous on the outside, like the temple of Joash that he restored, but we have to address the problem at its root, cut it out, and take care of the situation. Jesus addresses the issue with the Pharisees because they had a similar issue that Joash did. They appeared righteous on the outside, looked good, taught good things, but on the inside they were corrupt and they were evil, and they never addressed their hearts. In Matthew chapter 23, we're going to read some of these harsh critiques Jesus has for the Pharisees. In Matthew 23, starting in verse 13, it reads, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces, for you don't go in, and you don't allow others entering to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You travel over land and sea to make one convert, and when he becomes one, you make him twice as fit for hell as you are." Dropping down to verse 25, it says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup, so that the outside of it may also become clean. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs, which appear beautiful on the outside, but inside are full of the bones of the dead and every kind of impurity. In the same way, on the outside you seem righteous to people, but inside you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You build the tombs of the prophets and decorate the graves of the righteous, and you say, if we had lived in the days of our ancestors, we wouldn't have taken part with them in shedding the prophets' blood. So you testify against yourselves that you are descendants of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up, then, the measure of your ancestors' sins." We'll stop reading right there. What Jesus is accusing the Pharisees of is exactly what we're talking about. They would appear righteous so that they would seem righteous to others, but inside they are corrupt and evil and are not addressing the issue of sin. The outside of their cup looks clean. It looks like these are the most righteous people around, but on the inside they've abandoned God, abandoned his ways, and are seeking to do evil. They're full of greed, self-indulgence, focused on themselves instead of on God. And I ask that we self-reflect on ourselves. Look at our hearts. Look at our cups. Are we just clean on the outside? Just showing up to church every Sunday, looking like we're doing well, looking like we're faithful, but on the inside, we haven't addressed the problem of sin. And when we leave here, we still live a life of sin. Is that where we are? Jesus asks us to look at the heart. It's the message of this. It's the message of the Sermon on the Mount as well. I recommend you go read that in its entirety. It is a reflection on ourselves, asking us, are we dealing with the issue? Address sin at the heart. Clean the inside of the cup. The last lesson I want to leave you is probably the biggest lesson we could take from this story of Joash. A lesson that is very relevant to the entire story is beware of your influences. And this comes in two parts. Beware of your influence on others. First, consider that. Jesus calls us to be lights to the world. And what this means is to be an influence in the world, to go out and live out our faith among men, among people who are not believers in God. Do good among them. Live after the ways that God asked us to, so that people see what we're doing and they're influenced by that, and hopefully they come to God through that. You might not always recognize it, but people see what we do wherever we go. And in small ways, this influences how they see us, how they think of us, whether for good or evil. And so for lights to the world, we are an influence for good in people's lives. But sadly, there are many people who go out carrying the name of Christian, but they're not lights in the world because the inside of the cup is still dirty. And so they're going out calling themselves Christians, and yet they're living like the rest of the world. And that influences people as well, but not for good. But what it does is it gives a misconception of what Christians are, what Christianity is. And instead of bringing people to God, it pushes them away because they don't want any part of God's plan if this is how Christians are. It's a sad truth, and I ask, are we adding to that problem? Are we being influences for good, or are we pushing people away from God? Are we being like Jehoiada, who made a covenant with the people to do right, and he went and did everything he could to do good among the people? Or are we being more like Joash, who are commanding the people to do evil and being an evil influence? Be careful of your influence among other people, because we do have an influence. And the other thing I want us to consider is other people's influence on us. Who do you allow to be an influence in your life? This is a church full of faithful, good people, people who come together to encourage one another, to help build one another up, and be an influence for good in people's lives. It is one of the greatest blessings that we have in the church, and we should take advantage of that because we need the help and support. Joash needed Jehoiada's encouragement and influence so that he could be a good king. And while that influence was in his life, while that influence was good for good was there, he did what was right. But his downfall began when he started to listen to the wrong people. Just as Athaliah was an advisor for evil to his father, Joash listened to evil influences in his life, influences that pulled him away from God instead of bringing him closer. And this should serve as a warning to all of us of the power of others' influence in our lives. So who do you allow to influence you? Do you allow people of the world to influence how you think, how you live? Do you give in to their pressure? People who don't care about God, do you listen to them, or do you listen to the people of God who encourage you to persevere through those things? We have to be incredibly careful about who we allow to have that kind of power and influence in our lives. Because influence can pull us towards God or push us away from God. So be wary of others' influence and your influence on others, because it is a very powerful thing. So I want you to self-reflect on all of these things. Consider where you are in your life. Are you at a point where you haven't committed yourself to these things yet? You haven't committed yourself to God and His good work. You could start that commitment any day. Or maybe you're like Jehoiada and you're doing your best to do what is right and be an influence for good. I praise you and encourage you to continue in that. Or maybe you're more like Joash, someone who started off strong, started off well, was a faithful follower of God, but along the way, he lost sight of what was right, fell away, went back to the ways of the world. I have one thing to say to you. God has not given up on you. Just like He had not given up on Joash and was calling him back to Him, God is calling you back to Him as well. And so this morning, if you need to return to God, we are here for you and we want to help you and pray for you. Or if you need to be baptized and commit yourself to this, have your sins washed away, you could do that this morning. Be washed by the blood of Christ and become a child of God and walk faithfully with Him. So if there's anything we could do for you, please let us know now as we stand and sing this invitation song.